The 80s. Being born in this decade meant you had all sorts of gaming consoles and home computers thrown at you, as everyone was trying to take advantage of the advancement in computing technology to somehow gain a foothold in a gaming market that up to this point hadn't quite captivated the masses, and had in fact almost died a death after the great video games crash of 1983. But this was all about to change when the Nintendo Entertainment System, or NES, was released. Depending on where you were in the world, you could get your hands on one of these somewhere between 1984 and 1987, and it was a literal game changer. In the US alone, the console sold over 30 million units, and at one point it was estimated that there was a NES console in one in every 3 households. It had a somewhat slower start in the UK, as the console would at first struggle for its share of the market in amongst already established brands such as the Commodore 64 and the ZX Spectrum, but it would eventually find its place. Nintendo were very picky about who could release games on its system, and had put an extensive quality assessment program in place to ensure that substandard games would not be released. This meant that we got the likes of Super Mario 1, 2 and 3, Tetris, Donkey Kong, Zelda, Metroid, there are more, Contra, Double Dragon, Punch-Out, and of course Ninja Turtles. I could go on, but needless to say, the NES had a strong library of games. Not long after the release of the NES, another Japanese game manufacturer would release a console with an aim of challenging the NES. That company was called SEGA, and the console was called the Master System. It allowed you to play 2 types of game, one loaded through a cartridge slot and the other with a Sega Games card, which was essentially a memory card used as game storage. Although as a child I never met a single person who had one of these cards. It came with a built-in game that would vary from region to region. Later, Sega would release a cheaper version of the console called the Master System 2, which removed the memory card functionality. Although I didn't feel it was as well built as the NES, as the buttons on the control pad always seemed to feel a bit loose and I was not a fan of the directional pad, the games were well designed and fun to play. Alex the Kid was Sega's answer to Mario, and it was very good. There was R-Type and Operation Wolf. Phantasy Star is still one of the best RPGs I've ever played and went on to spawn lots of sequels. There was also Golden Axe Warrior, California Games and Prince of Persia. But despite having some good games, the console went on to fall short in competing with the NES. In its first year, it had only sold 125,000 units in North America, compared to the 1.1 million that the NES had sold. The poor sales were in part the fault of Sega, as they signed poor distribution and publishing deals with companies that had no experience with computer games. In the UK, for example, the distributor was unable to meet the pre-orders on time, which resulted in a ton of cancelled orders. Although it should be said that the Master System did eventually gain some traction in the UK and prove to be a success. Sega's advertising department was also much smaller than Nintendo's, putting them on the back foot straight away. But the main problem was caused by Nintendo, as the publishing deals they signed with third-party developers meant that those games could not be licensed for the Master System. This resulted in Sega porting some games from other developers with varying degrees of success, and meant they needed to develop some of their own games. This inevitably meant that the Master System library was not as strong as that of the NES. These two consoles went head to head for the next few years, with the NES firmly establishing itself as the dominant console worldwide, as it sold almost 70 million units compared to the 20 million the Master System sold. Sales in the UK were apparently much closer. However, this isn't reflective of my memory of the time, as I only knew a couple of people who owned the Master System, but almost all of my friends owned an NES. However, Sega was about to step up its game when in 1988 it launched the first ever 16-bit console, the Sega Mega Drive, or Sega Genesis in North America. Straight away, they had an advantage over Nintendo, who didn't have a 16-bit console, and Sega aimed to take full advantage of this fact. Having fallen short with the advertising for the Master System, Sega weren't going to make the mistake again. They launched straight into a full advertising campaign that not only highlighted the power of their system, but also took shots at Nintendo, One of their own slogans read, "Genesis does what Nintendo don't." On top of this, they addressed the problem of Nintendo's third-party publishing rights by licensing their own games using well-known celebrities and athletes such as Arnold Palmer and Michael Jackson. The system would also come with a new built-in game, Altered Beast, a game that in hindsight was an early indication of moves that Sega would be making away from cartoon-style, child-friendly graphics and gameplay. Nintendo weren't going to just sit idly by and let Sega lord it over them with their more powerful console, so in 1990 they announced the release of the Nintendo Entertainment System, or SNES for short. And they had an ace up their sleeve, as the console launch came with a new Super Mario game, Super Mario World. At launch, there weren't many games to choose from, but these few titles were well received. It wasn't long after the launch of the SNES that I noticed there had been a change. The split between those that owned Nintendo or Sega consoles had shifted and was now much more even. In part, this was down to the fact that Mega Drive was released earlier, but the fact that these people didn't switch to the SNES just goes to show the quality of the Mega Drive, and that the memory of the Master System was well and truly in the past. Although the Mega Drive had performed notably better than the Master System, Sega was still unhappy with their market share, so it was then, in 1990, they changed their strategy and decided to expand their aggressive marketing campaign to include more regions, and yes, this meant more attacks on Nintendo. They then lowered the price of the Mega Drive and released a new version that contained a new built-in game. That game was Sonic the Hedgehog, and in Sonic, Sega had found its hero, a character they could build their brand around, just as Nintendo had done with Mario. And it worked. The schoolyard arguments were now twofold: Sega or Nintendo, Sonic or Mario. Sega had succeeded in creating a pop culture icon, and on the back of this game's release, the Sega Mega Drive was to see a sharp uptake in sales. Even the most hardened Nintendo fanboy could not help but be a little bit jealous of Sonic. It looked good, it was fun to play, and it moved faster than any game we had ever seen. Not long after the release of Sonic, Sega dropped Sonic 2 on Sonic Tuesday, and with it came a huge advertising campaign with the term blast processing. What's blast processing, I hear you say? Nobody knew. Because what we did know is that it somehow turned the Mega Drive into an overpowered monster, making it the most powerful computing system on the planet, and that one day NASA would use this technology to help land men on Mars. None of this is true, but it didn't matter, because Sega used the term in all its advertising, highlighting the fact that the SNES does not have blast processing, and was therefore inferior. One advert even compared the two consoles, highlighting that without blast processing, you end up with slow games like Mario Kart. The argument made it into the schoolyard playground, the Sega fans shutting down any Nintendo argument with blast processing. Nobody could argue, because nobody knew what it meant. In reality, blast processing was just a term that the Sega marketing team had picked up from a tech demo. They liked the sound of it and ran with it. It worked so well that apparently Nintendo took out a double-page spread in a number of gaming magazines to rebut the claims. But this was just indicative of Sega's take-no-prisoners marketing strategy of the time. You couldn't buy a gaming magazine without finding multiple double-page spreads from Sega telling you how powerful their console was. Now that Sega had started publishing its own games, we started to see a difference in how each respective company viewed their own brand. Whilst Nintendo chose to keep its child-friendly image, Sega started to brand itself as the edgier console, with more violent and adult content. This was exemplified in the release of Mortal Kombat, a violent fighting game that featured brutal finishes that would see characters decapitated and killed in various ways. On Nintendo, the game was released with the blood effects toned down, but the Mega Drive version allowed you to unlock all of the brutal finishes by entering a special code, a code that soon found its way into the back of everybody's instruction manual. But it's not like Nintendo didn't have violent video games, because they did. They just chose not to use them as part of the branding. And come the release of Mortal Kombat 2, Nintendo made no changes to the violent content. I should also point out that throughout all of this, the two companies were also battling out in the handheld market, with the Game Boy and the Game Gear. It doesn't take too much research to figure out that the Game Boy was the eventual winner here, given its popularity and length of time the brand was in use. However, I should give the Game Gear its due, as it was a great handheld, and in many ways I preferred it to the Game Boy. It's just unfortunate it took so many batteries to power and yet had such a short battery life, and it didn't have the most extensive games library. Had Sega just been willing to back the Game Gear a little more, then it could have been a completely different story. The console war would go on to see Sega achieve what many thought was impossible, in that they nearly toppled Nintendo. Although they were never going to beat Nintendo in Japan, they managed to eat into the market share in America, and at one point was considered the best-selling console and dominant brand. In the UK, it is said that the Mega Drive outsold the SNES, although when you research this, it's hard to find any definite figures. And as I mentioned before, that speaks true of my own experience, as it seemed that more and more of my friends ended up owning a Sega Mega Drive. But the big winner during all of this was undoubtedly the gamers, as both brands tried to outdo one another. We were treated to great game after great game. The two consoles gave us such memorable titles as Street Fighter II, Aladdin, Donkey Kong, NBA Jam, Super Metroid, Streets of Rage 2, Super Bomberman, and Zelda. As each console would release a new title, the momentum would swing one way to the other, boosting sales, but it wouldn't last, as eventually one of those companies would start to make some poor decisions. In an attempt to keep things fresh, both Sega and Nintendo released a number of add-ons and accessories. For the SNES, we got the Super Scope, the Super Game Boy, and the SNES mouse that could be used to play Mario Paint. Sega went in a different direction and gave us the 32X and the Sega CD. These add-ons continued to highlight the difference in each company's branding and marketing strategy, as Nintendo simply looked to introduce add-ons that made the game more fun for children, whereas Sega made the bolder leap of trying to create new technologies aimed at an older audience. The 32X boasted better graphics and a larger colour palette. It could be attached via a cartridge slot and would allow you to play the more powerful 32X games. Problem was, the 32X cost just as much as the Mega Drive, and there was just not enough games released to warrant spending this sort of money. It was a similar story with the Sega CD, as the price point put a lot of people off. There were some good games, but there were too many ports of Sega Mega Drive games. It was also pushed on the back of its FMV games that used full motion video, but more often than not, these games weren't all that fun, and from my experience, they were always too hard. Then of course, there was the controversy around Night Trap that was the focus of a congressional hearing regarding violence in video games. This led to the introduction of an age rating system for computer games, much like what existed in the film industry. Despite a lot of my friends owning a Mega Drive, I only had one friend who owned a 32X and one other that owned a Sega CD. A couple of years after their release, Sega discontinued both the 32X and the Sega CD. In 1994, Sega continued its push to advance console gaming with the release of the Sega Saturn, a next-generation console with games that came in CD-ROM format. The Saturn boasted impressive 3D graphics, and Sega intended to bring many of their popular arcade titles to the platform. However, the launch of the Saturn had its problems, the first of which came from Sony, who, after having had their request to build a console with Sega declined, released their own console, the Sony PlayStation, at a cheaper price point than the Saturn. Then, in America, the decision was made to launch the Saturn early, which resulted in there not being enough consoles to supply demand. Sega also angered a number of outlets by not supplying them with the console at launch. Some of these companies then refused to stock the Saturn at all. Then after the shaky launch, Sega just didn't deliver on the quality of games. They pushed forward with their popular arcade titles, but many of them lacked the depth that consumers were now coming to expect from their console games. As the Saturn struggled to compete with the PlayStation, Sega also stopped focusing on the Mega Drive, which turned out to be a mistake, as despite the next-gen consoles being available, sales of previous generation remained strong. Sega continued to produce Mega Drive consoles, but its push for games development had been focused on the failed 32X, Sega CD, and now the Saturn. During this time, Nintendo had continued to focus on the SNES, which was still selling in large enough numbers while they worked on Project Reality, which would eventually become their own next-gen console. The Sony PlayStation went on to outsell the Saturn 2-1. The two failed projects, followed by what were perceived to be disappointing sales figures for the Saturn, led to a large drop in revenue at Sega. For me, the best example of Sega's mishandling of the Saturn comes in the form of its Sonic the Hedgehog releases. The most famous of all Sega's creations was bound to feature on the console and would no doubt boost sales. However, the standalone Sonic game that was expected never materialised. Sonic appeared in some not very well received spin-off games such as Sonic 3D Blast and Sonic R, as well as Sonic Jam, which saw the Mega Drive games ported over. However, the one game that may have seen Saturn compete with Sony and Nintendo, Sonic Extreme, never saw the light of day. As Sega struggled to push the Saturn and increase its market share, Nintendo saw the release of their own next-gen console in 1996, the Nintendo 64. Nintendo had gone a different route to Sega and Sony and released another top-loading cartridge console. Nintendo kept its branding on point by focusing on a younger audience and were clever enough to have a Mario game ready at launch. Mario 64 was released to widespread critical acclaim and remains the best-selling N64 game of all time. The popularity of Mario 64, along with other games such as GoldenEye, saw N64 sales surpass that of the Saturn, although the real winner in this generation was Sony, as the PlayStation had outsold both consoles, reportedly selling over 100 million units, whilst the N64 shifted over 30 million units and left the Saturn lagging well behind with under 10 million units sold. All three companies would be set to do battle once again, and another newcomer was set to join. Unfortunately for one of them, the loss would be too much to take and would well and truly see them lose the war. In 1998, Sega released the Dreamcast. As usual, they were ahead of the game and had the console on shelves before any of the competition. They learnt from their mistakes with the Saturn and had a Sonic game ready to go at launch with an impressive collection of launch titles. The launch was successful and they flew off the shelves. However, Sony had already announced the PlayStation 2 was in development, and if Sony's claims were true, then it was a much more powerful console. Then, in 2000, the PS2 landed and delivered on its pre-launch promises. Microsoft then announced it was entering the console market with the Xbox, and even though the console hadn't been released, it garnered a lot of buzz, and to make things worse, Nintendo had also announced the development of the GameCube. Pressure was now on Sega to push sales and establish a share of the marketplace before the release of these consoles. But it didn't happen. Despite having the early release and promising launch sales, the Dreamcast struggled to compete with the PlayStation 2. Then, on January 31st, 2001, Sega made an announcement that shocked the gaming industry. Just over 2 years after the Dreamcast was released, it was discontinued, and the company announced it would no longer be making gaming consoles and would instead focus on creating games as a third-party developer. All of this happening before the Nintendo GameCube had even been released, which turned out to be a moderate success, helping to keep the company afloat. You know the rest. Sony and Microsoft went on to dominate the gaming industry, while Nintendo had a huge success with the Wii. Despite Sega's perceived failings, most gamers will have fond memories of the company. Despite the mishandling of the Saturn and the Dreamcast, both were great consoles, which I still personally own, and the Mega Drive will always be included in any debate for the greatest console of all time. Personally, I feel that Sega may have just been a bit ahead of their time. The shift to focus on an older audience with more adult-centric gaming proved to be a correct prediction for the future of the gaming industry, with the average age of gamers today being between 18 and 34, and the most popular titles on the market being Call of Duty and Grand Theft Auto. It's just a shame that Sega tried to push this move too early, as it could easily have all ended up very different. What are your memories of Sega and Nintendo, and what was your favourite console? Let me know in the comments.